First question, what are the major sources of information on the Hebrew kingdoms from this period? Well, we sort of reviewed this, and it's also described in the essay. We've got the biblical books of Samuel and Kings. There are also some contemporary prophetic books. Isaiah and Jeremiah both describe the monarchy period, and a number of the other prophets do too. Amos, for example, is a very interesting character. We'll talk more about him next time. You have some non-Israelite monuments and documents that make reference to Israelite kings, like the inscriptions about Yehu, the king who pays tribute, or Hezekiah being besieged. And we have the archaeological sites and cities that we've uncovered and dated to that time period, be it by carbon dating or pottery dating or decomposition dating, and a number of other ways that they can date those layers. So the second question, this is one more worth discussing. I'm going to open up the window so we can see if people do want to ask questions. How does theological history, like the biblical account of the Judean and Israelite monarchies, differ from what we today call history? So reading this theological version in the Book of Kings versus reading what you'd think of today as a history book, what are some of the differences between the two?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think a big one is the intervention and causal factor of deities is a big one. The Assyrians didn't just leave; they were struck down by God defending his people. That definitely, you don't see a lot of those in the real peer-reviewed historical articles.
Right. Divine intervention is not a respectable causation mechanism, right? Now, who knows what the future holds for history, right? If current trends continue. Yeah, Susie, go ahead.
Well, it seems like the theological history, the Deuteronomic history, has the purpose of illustrating and defending God's agency. We're more interested in finding out what really happened.
I think also the idea that what happens to you is a function of your ritual, ethical, and religious behavior, as opposed to geopolitical circumstances and how big was your army and what was your trade deficit. And, that's how we would decide why a kingdom is destroyed in an invasion. But this history would say your kingdom was destroyed in an invasion because you disrespected Yahweh, and he brought the Assyrians to smack you around and teach you a lesson. So that's a very different dynamic of how you're explaining why and how things happen. But I will say, I mean, if you read accounts of events in the 1700s, even in the 1800s, you'll have plenty of people who would describe their events as based on providence or on punishment. Even Abraham Lincoln, in describing the scourge of the Civil War, said it's basically we're paying penance for slavery. We're getting bled out for this terrible wrong that was done, and that was the reading of history. So it's not that far away from our experience to have people reading history through the lens of cataclysmic cosmic judgment events, and there are still plenty of people out there who do it today, who would read history in that way, whether it's the Israelite the modern Israeli victory in the 6-Day War as a sign of divine providence and promising of the land for settlement, or other geopolitical events that are seen through a theological lens.
Isn't this sort of the trial of the Jewish people? It always seems like there's believing in that. I mean, the divine intervention, and you haven't been good enough, so therefore we're gonna challenge you again, and we're going to make it life more difficult, and now figure out a way to get out of it again. Which is sort of almost opposite of what happens in Israel, it seems. I mean, it's almost like they have a completely, a much less religious bent, and so therefore, seem to say, okay, well, when I look at those geopolitical things, I have more control than just assuming that there's a God that's, leading me one way or the other.
Well, look, I mean, they have the Mossad, the Secret Service, on purpose. They're not just crossing their fingers and going to synagogue. So there's definitely a sense of human agency and responsibility there. But there are some who have that divine confidence and, would apply that to geopolitical circumstances. It's faith-based diplomacy, it's faith-based geopolitics, and it can get you in trouble. Certainly got the old Israelites in trouble.
So let me point out, okay, that the discipline of history is actually pretty recent. So that the idea of analysis and causality that isn't divinely, entertained is really from the 19th century, maybe the very late 18th century and on with the Enlightenment. So what you're talking about are chronicles and propaganda and justificational chronicles. So people wrote chronicles not just to tell you what happened during the time, but very often with an editorial view in mind. Even the monks who wrote chronicles, in the Middle Ages, had a very specific reason for writing them, to show how bad things were and why people had gone bad and so forth. And in a sense, what the Bible is doing is very much, it's a chronicle. Here's the chronicle of these people, and whether or not it's actually real, it's not the point. It's what we're trying to get across to you and justify why what should have happened, or whatever. Anyway, that's just.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, even the historians have an agenda. They're just, they do their best to try to manage it. But look, when you read sort of alternate histories, Howard Zinn's version of the history of the United States, or the Lost Cause version of the Civil War, those historians have their agendas, and they're shading the truth one way or the other based on what they want to see come out of it. So we shouldn't have this like idealized vision of the pure, rational, robotic historian who can simply project a version of the story that's absolutely factually true without any kind of bias to it. That's not how human brains work. That's not how human beings are. But certainly you could do better than the sources we have. And that's what modern historians are trying to do.
Well, I would point out, though, that the so-called historians of the lost cause are not historians. They're propagandists. I mean, they take a conclusion and then they cherry pick history to suit what they want to conclude. And that's the real historian. Yes, we have biases we cannot avoid. And certainly, if I'm a Marxist historian, I'm going to emphasize certain kinds of analysis versus if I am a so-called conservative historian or a Whig historian. I mean, those things we understand. And of course, that's why we have faculty conferences and arguments all the time.
Right.
We don't, but a good historian doesn't draw the conclusion of first and then go back and find the history to suit it, which is what many chronicles do.
Yeah, Susie?
To the extent that even current academic historians want to study history to learn lessons to direct future, they're going to find those lessons. And of course, those lessons are going to be influenced by their biases and perspectives. So we're always going to have that interpretation part of the record. You're never going to get a purely agnostic, totally devoid of interpretation kind of presentation.
Honestly, that would be really boring. I find that kind of history kind of dry. All right, so
yeah, it's called bullet points. It's called PowerPoints.
Yeah, that, like I said. Yeah, Rin, and then we're going to move on.
I would just add, I mean, beyond any interpretation in both journalism and history, you're presenting a point of view simply by what stories you choose to tell and which you choose to leave out, because you can't tell all of history. So if the stories you tell are of, the underdog winning, that's giving an entirely different message than the underdog being crushed by mighty powers, even if they're all just as factually true.
We don't have the polytheistic versions of these texts, right? We only have the critique of polytheism. So we don't know what they would have said or how they might have defended themselves. So that's one of our limitations of sources, is what's preserved. We're sort of captive to that. Let's look at the next one. And this is more the function of this theology of history. How might the Deuteronomic history have enabled the Hebrews to maintain their religious identity when they were politically and militarily defeated? And what are some of the negative consequences of this theology? So just to give you context, in many cases in the ancient world, when your military was defeated, when your kingdom was conquered, it also meant your gods were beaten. The other kingdom's gods beat up my God, and now we're defeated, all of us. So how might a Deuteronomic history have enabled Hebrews to maintain an identity even after defeat? Sure, Rin.
Well, it pretty much takes away all of evidence-based decision making with regard to your God, because completely different events lead to the same conclusion. Yahweh is all powerful. You win the battle, Yahweh was on your side. You lose the battle, Yahweh's punishing you.
Why are you saying
There's
that?
no way to
You just
disprove.
gave evidence for both sides. What do you mean no evidence?
Exactly. It's no longer a disprovable hypothesis that your God is the best God.
Right. Heads Yahweh win, tails your God loses. That's all.
Exactly.
There you go.
Yeah, Yahweh can't lose. And so that becomes highly propagandistic.
Right. Well, it provides an explanation for a catastrophe that preserves the power of Yahweh, even elevates it even more by saying, no, you think you beat us? Pfft, our God wanted us to lose because of all the bad things we did to him. It has nothing to do with you. You guys are like pawns.
And the negative
So
consequence is there's no tether to reality. It's all a foregone conclusion. There's no reality whatsoever.
Well, it's even worse than that, because you can maybe hope that repentance and getting back on the right course will bring you redemption. Yahweh will, things will come around again. You might have a deliverer who comes, a Messiah, something like that. But the flip side is when the bad things happen to you, whose fault is it? You did it. If Yahweh caused this terrible thing to happen to you, you must have done something. It's a blame the victim theology. Because if a disaster happens, you must have sinned. Because Yahweh is in charge and he's fair and he runs everything. So if he runs everything and you're suffering, you must have done something wrong.
Or it was Moshe down the street and we need to go beat up on him until he prays better.
Yes, you might argue within the community too, but I meant y'all. Y'all are suffering because y'all did the wrong thing. It's the you plural that works in Hebrew. It doesn't work as well in Northern English, but there is a functional category in other dialects that works for the you plural. Yeah, Joel?
So, I broaden this out to other things. I mean, you see the baseball players suddenly looking up to the sky and, crossing themselves and going, hey, somebody must be on my side to make me get a great hit or run or do something. And, it seems like the Jewish people have owned that for an awfully long period of time. Either, as you were saying before, either I've been really good and therefore I should be successful, or I've been really bad and therefore I'm going to get punished for that indiscretion.
Well, look, it's the same theology, just applied, through Christianity and through other approaches to the same concept of if you've got one God who's all powerful, who's running everything, then that's how the cookie crumbles. My favorite example of this, though, was there was a case maybe 8-10 years ago, at the very end of a football game, and this Buffalo Bills receiver dropped the winning touchdown pass. And then he went on Twitter an hour or so later and he said, God, how could you do me like that? I praise you 24/7. So it was the one time someone actually got mad and started yelling, God, how could you do it? Like, and then he got a lot of flack for it. He sort of backtracked on it. But it was a very raw moment of someone actually being consistent about this, Like if I would praise him for giving me the winning touchdown catch and then he made me drop it so I looked terrible, then maybe I'm mad at him, I was refreshed by the honesty. But it's very rare to see something like that.
I think too, it kind of helps people play the long game. Using the sports metaphors, I'm a Cubs fan and a Bears fan. If I am not good with long suffering, then I am screwed. And so by having these tales of like, okay, yeah, you know what, this sucked and we got our butts kicked. We were held in captivity for generations and it was terrible. But, then we came back victorious. It's, all of us sitting here going, but the Bears in 85 were really good. So we can be.
Right.
It's that kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna like hold on to this history so that I can make sense of the crap now by looking forward to what, God is going to do or how we're going to be victorious and, whatever is coming up.
Great. This is a demonstration of a theological principle that some people would rather have a system that makes sense even if it makes them blame themselves, rather than a system that just runs randomly. So they'd rather imagine the universe runs on this cause and effect, and I sinned and I suffer, than there's nobody in charge and things happen by natural cause and effect, and sometimes bad things happen to good people and it just sucks. That's harder for some people to accept than a system that blames themselves when anything bad happens. They'd rather have that because that makes sense.
Guilt is often easier to bear than the knowledge that you were completely powerless.
Right. Guilt is easier than innocence. That's an interesting way to frame it. Yeah. Okay. So question number 4 just describes the history of the Hebrew kingdoms, which we talked about. They're only really together for about 100 years or so, from Saul through the end of Solomon, according to the biblical account. And the unification was an outside threat from the Philistines. They wanted a king like other nations to lead them in battle, and in the end, they split over this rivalry between North and South. Now, number 5, according to the Bible, which is the more important, and what does historical archaeological studies say? Well, I said this a little while ago, the Northern Kingdom gets less attention, but probably was bigger in its heyday than the Southern Kingdom, based on archaeological records. Omri's prominence, remember that reference to Beit David? There's also a reference to Yahu, son of Omri. He's referenced as the founding king of that northern dynasty in that Assyrian inscription with the king bowing with his tush in the air. But that theological history means you're going to blame the Northerners because they were destroyed by the Assyrians. They must have done really bad things. And so we're going to ascribe to them all the evil, the golden calves and worshiping and the division and all that stuff is their fault. And so then it was justified in what happened to them. And the last question begins to open up the can of worms. Was Jerusalem always a central Jewish location? And was Hebron, which is the birthplace supposedly of King David? And how could the answer to these questions be important today? I'm sorry, Hebron wasn't David's birthplace. David's born in Bethlehem, which again is familiar to you. But Hebron became his first capital before he moved to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem wasn't always a central Jewish location. We know that because they conquered it. I mean, it's explicitly said they conquered it is at some point in time. Why does that become important? Both the claims to Jerusalem, which is the modern day capital of Israel, and also the claim to Hebron, which today is in the middle of the Palestinian Authority West Bank.
People are much more apt to engage in lots of violence over whichever one they connect to their historical identity most strongly. So whichever one is most ascribed historically, there's going to be lots of bloodshed over it.
Yeah, Serbians are still mad that one of their central shrines is in Kosovo, which is now an independent territory. Even though they lost a battle there in 1380 whatever, it's still an important part of their identity, and they want to have it as part of their territory. And Hebron claims to be the burial place of the patriarchs Abraham and his wife Sarah as well, and the capital of King David is claimed to be there. And remember, that line of King David becomes theologically important because you have all those kings in a row from David until the ending of the line in Zedekiah. But if you read the genealogy at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament, you have 12 generations from Adam to Abraham, and 12 generations from Abraham down to Moses, and then 12 generations from Moses down to David, and then a number of other generations. But ultimately, it goes from David to Joseph, who's the husband of Mary. And there's a claim of pedigree there. And to get the claim of pedigree, it helps to know ancient languages. The word for Messiah in Hebrew is Mashiach. Mashiach literally means anointed with oil. That was the way you marked a king. In fact, when the prophet Samuel marks David as the king, he puts oil on his head as a special way of anointing him as the king. He becomes the Mashiach. He's the Davidic anointed one who's promised to become king. Now, the Greek term for anointed is Christos. So Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph, it's not like the family last name was Christ. It's his title. He is Jesus the Anointed, Jesus the Messiah. And people who grew up in traditional Passover Seders sing about it every year, not about Jesus, but about the Messiah. They sing a song about Elijah. Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. Eliyahu Hatishbi, the Tishbaite from that sub-tribe. Eliyahu HaGiladi, the Gileadite from that part of the kingdom. And then the middle part, Bimhera B'Yamenu, soon in our days, Yavo Aleinu, come to us, Im Moshiach ben David, with the anointed, the son of David, the Messiah from the line of King David. So it's still appealing, even in the modern Haggadah, to that ancient memory of the line of King David, the Beit David, the house of David, to bring the Redeemer, the anointed one, who can put us back in the position of autonomy and independence that we lost so many centuries ago. So that's the hope of the Deuteronomic history, that the good line of King David will ultimately reestablish itself and reestablish the independence of the kingdom. The problem is that reality and history have other things to say about it. So next time, when we come back in 2 weeks, hopefully in a better world, we'll see, we will turn to this question of Yahvism and the development of Jewish religion during the same First Temple monarchic period, and get a better sense of both, again, what the Bible's version of the story is, and also what the archaeological and textual record can yield when you look at it in a little more critical way. On the other hand, maybe next week we'll have changed our secular perspective and decide we are suffering for our sins and things have gone poorly. So we'll check back in 2 weeks, and thanks again for coming out tonight. Any last comments, questions, reactions?
I have a question for you.
Please.
So if Jerusalem is the capital of Judea, and the line of David, the house of David, of the kings of Judea, why did they name the modern king? Why did they name the modern state Israel instead of Judea?
Well, that was a debate. They were debating this. Now, the challenge has to do with the fact that we weren't jumping from 586 BCE to 1948. Okay, so there's the language evolved over time, and people would refer to the Beit Yisrael, the house of Israel, or the Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and that's a common phrase that's used throughout the rabbinic sources and liturgy, much more so than the Beit Yehuda, the house of Judah. So also remember, in the genealogy, you've got the 12 tribes. Who's the father of the 12 tribes? It's Israel.
That's true.
Jacob, who becomes Israel. That's the national patriarch, right?
That makes sense. Okay.
Whereas Judah is just one of the 12 tribes. So that would be, now the other 10 tribes supposedly vanished, right? They get conquered by the Syrians, they're exiled, they become the lost tribes of Israel. So in theory, they could have said, screw them, they're gone. We're just Judeans now. And in fact, the idea of referring to ourselves as Jews goes back to Judea. In fact, during that siege of Jerusalem under Hezekiah, the Assyrians sent an emissary to talk to the people under siege. And the people under siege say, speak to us in Aramite, speak to us in Aramean, so the people in the city don't understand. We speak diplomatic language, we can do this. And the guy says, no, I'm going to speak to them in Yehudit. I'm going to speak to them in Jewish or in Judean, because they should know that they're going to be drinking their own urine during the siege here. I mean, he's very threatening, right? But what's fascinating is the reference to the language. It's not called Ivrit, it's not Hebrew, it's Yehudit. It's Judean that he's speaking, that they would understand. But again, as time went on, you know, the idea of being limited to just the Judeans or the Judahites became more limiting. And so the nation was called the Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Even if we are Yehudim, we're Jews. And also the other issue was, you know, in European languages, there's often two words referring to Jews. One is respectful and one is a slur. So in Russian, for example, if you say Evreysky, that's respectful. If you say Żyd, that's a slur. And similar in Polish and similar in some other languages. So in French, for example, all of the respectable Jewish institutions they made for themselves would use the phrase Israélite. The Alliance Israélite Universelle, for example, which ran a network of schools and educational institutions in the Middle East. But they wouldn't call it the Jewish Alliance, because Juif was a bit more of a slur. And even in America, most of the institutions used Hebrew or Israelite in the late 19th century rather than Jewish, because that was sort of a less respectful term in some circles.
Yeah.
So again, it's part of the evolution of language over those centuries. They could have called it Jewland, but they settled on Israel as something that had more of a sort of biblical resonance to it.